One little girl cried alone in the dark, but it was the dog who heard her first. A bitter wind swept through the fields that night, and while the world moved on, one retired K9 stood at the edge of the barn, tail low, heart alert. Somewhere inside that old wood and rust, someone was hiding. Not from monsters, but from heartbreak. No one else saw the tiny prints in the frost. No one else heard the sobs muffled in straw. But he did. And what he led the old man to changed everything. A forgotten child, a soldier's promise, and a bond that would melt even the coldest winter. This is the story of a pink dress, a faithful dog, and how love found its way home. Before we begin, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. And if you believe this little girl deserves a miracle, type Amen in the comments to let her know she's not forgotten. The wind that swept across the edges of Harper's Hollow that night carried more than cold. It carried weight, like the hush before something falls. Snow had not yet come, but the sky was bruised and full of warning. Dry leaves skipped across the abandoned roads, the last breath of autumn scraping against early winter's throat. Somewhere in the north of New York State, nestled in a forgotten fold of farmland and silence, stood an old ranch that hadn't seen a visitor in weeks. Inside the house, Walter Harlan stood at the kitchen sink, mug in one hand, the other resting on the windowsill. He was 60 years old and had the look of a man carved by weather and war. His beard was silver white and trimmed close, his hair thinning but combed back with care. His frame was still strong, but his right shoulder sloped slightly, shrapnel injury from his last tour overseas. He didn't talk about it much, just like he didn't talk about the photographs tucked in the drawer beside the oven. His eyes, though quiet, carried that familiar heaviness soldiers never fully put down. The house was warm but silent. The old clock ticked. The fireplace whispered its dry, crackling tune. But outside, something was wrong. Scout hadn't moved for hours. The old German shepherd sat like a statue on the porch, ears pricked, tail still, eyes fixed on the distant outline of the barn. 11 years old, Scout was a retired K9, trained for search and rescue, now living out the last of his years beside the man who had trusted him with his life more than once. His coat was thinning at the haunches, and his gait had stiffened, but his eyes, amber, sharp, always alert, hadn't changed. And tonight, those eyes had not once turned from the barn. Walter noticed. He had noticed every night for the past week. At first, he chalked it up to boredom, then to memory. But this night, Scout's posture was different, tense, unmoving. Walter could feel it now, like static in the air. He knocked the last of the grounds from his mug and stepped out onto the porch, coat already draped over one arm. "You're still at it, huh?" he muttered, mostly to himself. Scout's ears twitched at his voice, but the dog didn't move. The wind bit through the seams of his jacket as Walter stepped into the yard. Dry, brittle grass crunched beneath his boots. In the distance, the barn loomed like an old skeleton, sagging at the edges, its red paint long faded to rust. The structure hadn't been used in years, not since Margaret passed, and he let the last of the horses go. He hadn't had reason to go near it since. Scout growled low in his throat. Walter stopped. "What is it, boy?" he said. But his voice came quieter now, like some part of him already understood. The dog gave a single bark, loud, sharp, insistent. Then he took off across the yard, not running, but trotting with urgency, tail level, shoulders squared. Walter followed without hesitation, one hand gripping the flashlight he always kept by the door, the other slipping toward the old utility knife on his belt. The barn door creaked open on hinges that screamed in protest. Scout stood just inside, motionless again, as if awaiting permission. The air inside was colder than Walter remembered, and thick with the smell of dust, old straw, and something else. Something faint and unfamiliar. Damp, maybe. Rot. Walter clicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing old hay bales, broken harnesses hanging like forgotten limbs, rusted farm tools nailed to crooked wooden beams. Nothing moved. And yet, Scout didn't relax. Walter took another step inside. The beam of light jittered slightly with his breath. He swept it left to right. There was a sound. Not loud. Just the faintest shuffle, like fabric dragging across wood, or something being pulled slowly through straw. Scout whined. The hairs on his back stood. Walter moved forward, the floorboards beneath him groaning with age. The beam caught on a corner behind the old feed sacks. Something shifted just beyond it. He stopped. A sudden wave of dread washed over him, thick and undeniable. Scout growled again, but it was softer now, a sound Walter hadn't heard since Bosnia. Not anger, not warning, fear. He raised the light higher, heart pounding. The beam flickered against an uneven shape on the ground, small, tangled, and still. It didn't belong there. It didn't look like part of the barn. Walter's breath caught in his throat. His hand trembled. He stepped closer, slowly, the beam narrowing, and what the light landed on made his chest tighten like a vice. He froze. Scout let out a mournful, guttural noise, stepping back behind Walter's legs. The cold air thickened. Walter couldn't move, couldn't blink. He was staring into something that didn't make sense. Not yet. Not fully. But he felt it in his bones. This moment was about to change everything. The barn was colder than Walter remembered. The old wooden beams groaned softly above, wind slipping through the cracks like whispers of something forgotten. Scout stood stiff beside him, his breath fogging in the air. Walter swept the flashlight once more across the room until the beam caught on a pile of hay tucked near the back wall, and the fragile figure nestled within. She was a child, a little girl no older than 6, curled like a rabbit in a burrow, her knees drawn to her chest. Her skin was pale beneath streaks of dirt, cheeks sunken, and lips chapped from the cold. Her hair, long and tangled, fell across her face like a veil. She wore a faded pink dress that might once have belonged to a birthday or a holiday, now torn at the hem, stained with mud and straw, and clinging damply to her small body. Walter crouched down slowly, heart pounding, the chill forgotten. "Hey there, sweetheart," he murmured, reaching out gently. The girl stirred. One eye cracked open, glazed and unfocused. She tried to move away but didn't have the strength. A weak sound escaped her throat, more breath than voice. "It's okay," Walter said. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." She didn't answer, but she didn't flinch again. Scout stepped closer and sniffed the edge of her dress, then looked back at Walter as if urging him to act faster. Without another word, Walter scooped the child into his arms. She was light, far too light, and her limbs hung limply against his chest. Her body radiated the kind of cold that seeped into the bones. Walter wrapped her in his old work jacket and carried her quickly to his truck, where Scout jumped into the back seat without waiting for command. The drive to the hospital felt longer than it was. The town of Elkhorn Ridge was mostly asleep, its windows glowing with warm light, while Walter raced through the dark, cradling the child like something precious and breakable. She never made a sound. At the emergency entrance, a nurse spotted him coming and rushed forward. She was in her 40s, compact and efficient, with auburn hair tied back and a firm but kind face. "What happened?" she asked, opening the door as Walter stepped inside. "Found her in my barn," he said, his voice shaking despite himself. "I think she's been out there a while." "Name?" "I don't know." Within minutes, the girl was surrounded by professionals. Doctors checked her vitals, cleaned her cuts, placed an IV. Scout waited in the hallway, pacing anxiously every time a door swung open. Walter sat outside the pediatric room, hat in his hands, staring at the floor. A young pediatrician came out eventually. Dr. Mason, mid-30s, dark skin, clean-shaven, with the calm voice of someone who'd seen a lot but never stopped caring. "She's stable now. Dehydrated, hypothermic, and exhausted, but no internal damage." Walter nodded. "Did she say anything?" "A little. Said her name's Lily. She asked if Scout was here." Walter's brows lifted. She remembered him? Apparently he was watching over her while she slept. Dr. Mason paused before continuing. "She also mentioned someone she called Mama Sarah, but when we asked if she was her real mother, she went quiet. She said she doesn't like her. Said she hides in the barn, so she won't find me." Walter's fists clenched. "She's got bruises," the doctor added, "old ones and new, and she's clearly been underfed." Walter exhaled slowly, his jaw locked. Her father? "She said he's away, a soldier, that he's been gone a really long time. She doesn't know where." Walter sat there for a long time, listening to the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint voices behind doors. Scout eventually curled at his feet and sighed, resting his chin on Walter's boot. In his mind, Walter saw flashes of the little girl lying in the hay, her face pressed to the cold floor, and something deep inside him stirred. A grief he thought buried, now rising like frost through soil. The nurse came by later and offered him coffee. Her name was Elena, tall, olive-skinned, soft-spoken. "She's been asking for you and the dog," she said with a small smile. Walter followed her to the room. Lily was awake now, propped up on pillows with a juice box in her hand. She looked even smaller in the hospital bed, but her eyes were alert, if cautious. When Scout entered, she smiled, a small, fleeting thing, but real. "You're safe now," Walter said, pulling up a chair. "No one's going to hurt you here." She stared at him a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you." "Do you know your last name?" She nodded slowly. "Rhodes." Walter felt his breath catch. "Your dad, is he in the military?" She nodded again. "He wears the green suit. He said he was going away just for a little, but he's been gone a long time." "How long?" She counted on her fingers, then gave up. "Forever." Walter reached for his phone. He knew some people, old friends from his service days. One of them, a retired logistics officer named Stanton, now worked with Military Family Services. If anyone could help find a deployed father, it was him. Lily finished her juice and looked at Scout, who had placed his front paws gently on the edge of her bed. She reached out, touching his head. "He found me," she whispered. Walter nodded. He sure did. The winter sun had barely risen above the horizon when Walter returned to the hospital. A fine mist of frost coated the windows of his truck, and Scout sat alert in the passenger seat, eyes scanning every movement on the sidewalk. Ever since that night in the barn, the old K9 had barely left Walter's side, and now he seemed to carry a quiet urgency in every step, as if he'd appointed himself Lily's guardian. Oh. Inside the pediatric ward, the halls were still quiet. Nurses moved softly from room to room, and holiday decorations hung half-heartedly along the walls. Walter walked in carrying a paper bag. Inside, a slice of his apple pie, wrapped in wax paper, and a second-hand children's book with faded corners. Lily was already awake, propped up with pillows, her small frame swallowed by the hospital blanket. She turned her head when she saw Scout, her eyes brightening with a warmth that cut through the sterile room like sunlight. "You came," she said softly. "Of course we did," Walter replied. "Brought you something sweet." She sat up slowly and reached for the bag, her movements still careful, still guarded. She was stronger today, but her eyes held the kind of old pain only children of neglect learn to carry. As she unwrapped the pie, something small slipped out from beneath the blanket and fell to the floor. Walter bent down to pick it up, thinking it might be a toy or tissue, but froze when he saw what it was. A crumpled sheet of notebook paper, folded tight and worn with creases. In the center, written in shaky handwriting, "Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared." There was more beneath it, the rest written with effort but interrupted by smudges, a stain of what looked like grape jelly, and shaky pen lines. "I don't like her," she yells. "I hide in the barn so she won't find me. I miss you every day. Please come soon. Love, Lily." Walter sat back in his chair, the note trembling in his hand. He glanced over at Lily, who had frozen with a bite of pie halfway to her mouth. "I was going to send it," she said, eyes wide with guilt. "But I didn't have a stamp." Walter didn't answer for a long moment. Then he nodded. "That's okay, sweetheart. We'll get it where it needs to go." Scout placed his head gently on Lily's lap, and she curled her fingers into his fur. The room fell into silence, the kind that isn't empty, but waiting. Later that day, when Lily drifted off to sleep with Scout curled beside her bed, Walter stepped outside the room and pulled out his phone. He called a man he hadn't spoken to in nearly 7 years, Major Hank Delaney. A stocky, no-nonsense former logistics officer with a deep Boston accent and a voice like gravel soaked in bourbon. "You're calling me before lunch, Belle," Hank grunted. "Someone die or just close?" Walter explained everything. The girl, the letter, the name. "Daniel Rhodes," Hank repeated, tone sharpening. "I know that name. Marine Corps, deployed early last year." "He's her father," Walter said. "She's 6. alone, hospitalized. Her stepmother abandoned her. There was a long pause. Then, "I'll see what I can dig up. You still live in Elkhorn Ridge?" "Same house. You'll hear from me in a day." That night, back at home, Walter sat at the kitchen table with Scout at his feet. The barn light flickered through the window like a memory that refused to leave. He placed Lily's letter beside a blank sheet of stationery and began to write. To Corporal Daniel Rhodes, "My name is Walter Bell. I'm a retired veteran living just outside Elkhorn Ridge. 2 nights ago, I found your daughter in my barn, cold, alone, and too thin for her age. She's at St. Mary's Hospital now, recovering. She's safe. She misses you. She's been through more than a child should. She wrote you a letter she never could send. I've included it here. I'm doing what I can until you return, but she needs her father. Please come home." He folded the note carefully and placed it with Lily's crumpled paper, sealing them both in an envelope addressed to Hank Delaney. Each morning after that, Walter arrived at the hospital with Scout and something small in hand: an orange, a muffin, a new storybook. Lily began to talk more. She told Walter about her real mother, who died 2 years ago, and about Sarah, the woman her father had married too quickly after. Sarah, according to Lily, was pretty but scary. She had long blonde hair that never moved, and sharp nails that clicked when she pointed. She smelled like cold perfume, and always talked too fast. "She doesn't like noise," Lily whispered once, "so I tried to be quiet. That's why I hid in the barn." "She ever hit you?" Lily paused. "Not like in cartoons. She pushes. Hard." Walter said nothing, but inside, something boiled. By the 4th day, even the nurses grew attached. Elena, the gentle night nurse, began bringing coloring books. Dr. Mason, usually composed and brisk, took extra minutes each visit to check on her drawings and tell her how strong she was. "Your dog stays close," Elena remarked to Walter one evening. "He hasn't left her side once." "He's always had good instincts," Walter replied, scratching Scout's ear. "I think he knows she needs us." That evening, as Walter sat beside Lily's bed reading from an old fairy tale book, the child leaned against his arm and whispered, "Do you think my daddy forgot me?" Walter put the book down. "No, Lily, I think he just doesn't know, but he will. Soon." She nodded slowly and added, "I hope he likes apple pie." The snow had stopped falling outside St. Mary's Hospital, but winter still pressed its fingers against every window pane. The trees stood bare and silent, and the world beyond the glass remained hushed under layers of white. Inside room 208, however, there was the faint sound of laughter. Walter was sitting beside Lily's bed, holding up a paper crane he had just folded from the wrapper of her breakfast muffin. "That one's named Scout Jr.," he said. "Doesn't bark, but he's good at spying on cookies." Lily giggled, a sound as bright and quick as the morning sun. Her cheeks, which just a few days ago had been hollow and ghostly, now showed a gentle pink. Her eyes sparkled more when she smiled. She was still thin, still bruised, but life had begun creeping back into her face in small, hopeful waves. Scout lay at her feet, head resting on the edge of the bed, his tail thumping softly every time she touched his ears. The nurses had long since stopped trying to keep the old K9 out. It was now understood. Where Lily went, Scout followed. He wore no vest anymore, no badge of his military past, but in the hospital he had become something else entirely: protector, comforter, guardian. They called him Lily's shadow. Nurse Elena came in with a tray and a soft smile. "Time for your vitamins, sweetheart." Elena had become one of Lily's favorites. She was tall and graceful, with skin the color of warm sand, and eyes always lined with empathy. Her touch was gentle, her voice even gentler. She had 2 sons of her own, and had a way of talking to Lily that made the girl feel like she mattered, like she was home. Lily took the pill and gulped it down with orange juice. "Miss Elena," she asked, voice small, "do you think I could keep one of the paper puppies?" Elena chuckled. "I think you will have an entire zoo before Mr. Walter's done folding them." Walter gave a playful grunt. "You call that a puppy? That one looks like a chicken with regrets." They all laughed, and even Scout let out a short, breathy snort. Later that afternoon, after the doctors made their rounds and the nurses left them in peace, Lily asked quietly, "Why do you come every day?" Walter leaned back in the chair, his shoulders stooped from years of ranch work and the weight of unspoken memories. He rubbed the back of his neck and looked at her thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "I guess I know what it feels like to be forgotten. After my wife passed, it got real quiet at home. Scout was the only one who still talked to me, and all he says is feed me or go outside. Then I found you in that barn. You looked like someone who'd been forgotten too, and I couldn't just walk away." Lily blinked at him, lips pressed in a straight line. "You talk like Daddy. Is that a good thing?" She nodded. "He tells stories too." Walter looked down at the paper animals on the side table, then added softly, "He'll be back, you know, your daddy. I've got people looking for him." She didn't say anything to that, but her hand reached again for Scout, as if the promise was more believable through fur than words. Over the next few days, Lily began to blossom like something thawing beneath winter soil. She asked for more stories. She tried folding her own paper animals. She asked Elena about how thermometers worked, and told Dr. Mason she wanted to be a dog doctor when she grew up. Walter brought in one of his late wife's old storybooks, well-worn, the edges curled like aging leaves. He read it to Lily each evening. Scout always sat beside the bed, eyes half closed, as if memorizing every word. One night, as Lily fell asleep to the story of a fox who had lost his tail, Elena pulled Walter aside. "She's healing fast," she said in a low voice. "Not just physically, emotionally. You're a big part of that." Walter looked through the window at Lily's small frame curled under the blankets, one hand resting on Scout's back. "She's tougher than I thought." "She trusts you." Walter hesitated. "I'm not family." "You might be the only family she remembers right now." That night, driving home in the quiet dark, Walter couldn't stop thinking about those words. He'd never imagined a world where he'd tuck a child into bed again, where laughter would echo again in his days. But Lily was no longer just a visitor in his life. She had begun to fill the quiet spaces. At home, he walked into the kitchen and found himself looking at the picture of his wife that hung above the fireplace. Margaret, with her warm eyes and unflinching grace. She had been a school teacher, the kind who remembered every student's birthday and stayed late to help kids learn how to spell their own names. "I think you'd like her," he whispered to the photo. "She's got a stubborn little heart, like you did." At the hospital the next morning, Lily grinned wide when Scout came bounding in. "I drew him," she said, holding up a rough crayon sketch. The proportions were odd. His legs too long, his eyes too big, but the expression was perfect, alert, kind, unmovable. Walter took the drawing and smiled. "Might just have to frame that." She pointed at a tiny figure next to Scout. "That's you." Walter looked again and saw a bearded stick figure with a hat and a piece of pie in hand. "I look skinny. That's very generous of you," she giggled. "I gave you pie. That's why you're happy." He ruffled her hair gently. "Well, then you understand me better than most." The morning after Lily's crayon drawing, Walter woke before the sun. The sky was a sheet of pewter above Elkhorn Ridge, and the frost had returned in full force, painting his front steps in slippery silver. Scout paced near the back door, restless. Walter filled a thermos with coffee, slipped on his coat, and without thinking too much about it, turned the truck back toward the barn, the one he hadn't entered since the night he found Lily curled beneath the hay. Something gnawed at his thoughts, a loose thread he couldn't ignore. As the old truck rumbled along the snow-dusted road, Walter glanced at Scout through the rearview mirror. The dog sat upright, his ears twitching. Even after years of retirement, Scout still picked up things Walter couldn't see. That sixth sense, the one that had saved more than one life in dusty, far-off places, hadn't dulled. They pulled up beside the barn. The structure stood against the pale light like a sentinel, tall and weather-worn, its planks groaning with age. Walter grabbed a flashlight and stepped inside. The scent of old hay, dust, and faint rot hit him first. But it wasn't the smell that stopped him. It was the shape near the far corner, half hidden beneath a loose tarp. A small, stuffed bear. He crouched and picked it up. One of the ears was torn, its fur grimy. He remembered Lily mentioning it once. Mama threw it away 'cause it smelled like mud. Her voice echoed faintly now, full of a child's quiet grief. Beside the bear, the straw had been disturbed. Walter used the beam of his flashlight to sweep the area and saw something glinting under the loft ladder. A child's necklace, tangled in hay, with tiny alphabet beads that spelled Lily. His heart twisted. Then he saw them, tire tracks. Not tractor tires, but smaller, cleaner, fresh. They hadn't been there a week ago. Walter followed them out the barn door and saw they cut across the far edge of his field, leading back toward the road before fading into the frozen ruts. Scout let out a low growl. Walter stood, every inch of him tense. Something was wrong. He knew it now with certainty. Lily hadn't wandered by accident. She'd been dumped. Forgotten. Discarded like her bear and necklace. Back at home, Walter pulled out an old file box from the pantry. Inside were contacts, dusty names on folded slips of paper. Some long gone, others retired. One, though, still worked with the sheriff's office. Deputy Carla Jensen, once a rookie he'd coached at a youth mentorship program. She was now 35, sharp as broken glass, with a no-nonsense tone and curly auburn hair, always tied into a bun that threatened to fall loose. When Walter called her, she picked up on the second ring. "Walter Bell, been a while." "Carla," he said, his voice level, "I've got something you need to see." They met at the barn 30 minutes later. Carla arrived in a gray sheriff's SUV, wearing her badge over a thick padded coat, eyes squinting behind rectangular glasses. She was shorter than Walter remembered, but carried herself like someone twice her size. He showed her the bear, the necklace, the tire tracks. "Hell," she muttered. "You sure the girl's still at the hospital?" "Safe and healing." Carla took photos with her phone, measured the tire marks, bagged the stuffed bear and the necklace in Ziploc evidence bags. "Got a name?" Walter nodded. "Her stepmother, Janine Rhodes." Carla paused at the name. "I know her. Worked a noise complaint at her house last year. Pretty, always dressed like she's late for a date. Cold. Thought she was too sharp for this town." Lily said she yells, that she hides to avoid being pushed. "Damn," Carla's jaw tightened. "You'll give me a written statement?" "I'll do better," Walter replied. "I'll tell you everything from the start." They stood for an hour as Walter recounted the full story. How he found Lily, how she spoke in whispers, how Scout had stood guard beside her like a sentry of forgotten souls. When he handed over Lily's crumpled letter, Carla didn't speak for a long while. "This isn't just abandonment," she said finally. "It's neglect, psychological harm, maybe more. If we find Janine knew where the girl was, or dumped her here on purpose, she needs to be held accountable," Walter finished. Carla nodded. "I'll file a case for investigation. I'll also contact CPS." Back at the hospital later that day, Walter didn't speak of what he'd found. Lily was coloring in bed, her legs crossed beneath the blanket, Scout's head once again serving as an armrest. When she looked up and smiled, Walter swallowed the knot in his throat. "You're early," she said. "Scout missed you," she giggled. "Scout always misses me." Walter sat beside her and pulled out a new storybook. "This one's about a goose who wanted to be a hawk." "That's silly," she said. "Goose can't fly that high. Not with those legs, no." She laughed again, and Walter let himself believe, just for a moment, that everything was going to be all right. But outside, the wind scraped against the glass like whispers from the past, and somewhere out there, a woman with ice in her veins and no guilt in her heart had gone quiet. And silence, Walter knew, could be the most dangerous thing of all. The courtroom was smaller than Walter expected. A 2-story brick building on the corner of Elkhorn's Main Street. It shared its walls with a dentist's office and a closed-down bakery. The interior smelled faintly of old paper and winter wool, and the wooden benches creaked with every nervous shuffle. The air felt heavy, not because of the snowstorm still lingering outside, but because of what was about to happen within. Walter sat in the front row beside Lily, who wore a soft blue sweater one of the nurses had knit for her. Her pink dress, the tattered one from the barn, had been carefully folded and stored away, a relic of something no child should ever live through. Scout lay at their feet, calm and alert, his ears twitching with every new sound. At the front of the room stood the judge, Marlene Hargrove. She was in her late 60s, tall and bony, with gray curls pinned back in a no-nonsense bun. Her glasses hung low on her nose, and her eyes were sharp, scanning every face with the weariness of someone who'd seen too many excuses in her lifetime. To her right sat Janine Rhodes, Lily's stepmother. Janine wore a sleek beige coat over a cashmere turtleneck and diamond stud earrings. Her long blonde hair was perfectly curled, and she had applied makeup with clinical precision, But her beauty, Walter thought, was all surface, like lacquer over rotted wood. She sat straight-backed, her expression composed, but her jaw clenched tight when her name was called. Her lawyer, a man named Curtis Vale, had a slick demeanor and a thin mustache that curled at the edges like punctuation. He wore a designer suit that looked out of place among the scuffed tile floors and water-stained ceiling. "Your Honor," Vale began, "my client is a hard-working woman who has done her best under very difficult circumstances. She never intended to abandon Lily. She simply assumed, wrongly yes, that the child had gone to stay with a neighbor during the weekend in question." Judge Hargrove didn't blink. A 6-year-old child, in a barn, unconscious, with signs of exposure and multiple bruises? Is that what you call a misunderstanding, Mr. Vale? Vale coughed, rearranged his tie, and said nothing. The prosecution called their first witness, Nurse Elena. She walked to the stand in her navy scrubs, her black curls pinned neatly, and placed her hand on the Bible without hesitation. Her testimony was direct, unwavering. "When Lily was brought in," Elena said, voice steady, "she was hypothermic, malnourished, and withdrawn. She flinched when approached and showed signs of prolonged emotional neglect. I personally examined the bruising on her arms and back, none of it accidental." "Had she eaten recently?" the prosecutor asked. "She said she'd stolen food from the trash the day before." Gasps rose from the benches behind them. Walter looked at Lily. She sat still, her eyes fixed on Scout. She didn't understand the legal jargon, but she knew people were talking about her. Next came Dr. Mason, the pediatrician. Tall and broad-shouldered, with sleeves always rolled up and a calm voice that never wavered, he described the first 48 hours of Lily's recovery. She was terrified, refused to speak above a whisper. Every time a woman entered the room, she turned her face to the wall. "Did she mention her stepmother?" "She called her the shouting one, said she hides when she hears heels." Walter's hands curled into fists in his lap. He kept his eyes on Janine, who sat unmoved, her gaze locked straight ahead. Finally, Walter was called. He walked slowly to the stand, hat in hand. In the light of the courtroom, his years showed, creases around his eyes, sun-darkened skin, and the slow gait of someone who had carried too much for too long. But his voice was clear. "I found Lily in my barn," he said, "lying in straw, wearing a pink dress that hadn't been washed in weeks. She was near frozen. I didn't know her name, but my dog, Scout, found her. Wouldn't leave her side." He recounted everything, the necklace, the bear, the tire tracks. The hush in the courtroom deepened with each word. "And why did you take her to the hospital?" "She was a child," Walter said simply, "alone, scared. I've seen enough war to know what abandonment does to the heart. I wasn't about to let it happen again, not on my land." The silence that followed was broken only by the faint scratching of the judge's pen. After closing statements, Judge Hargrove leaned forward. "Janine Rhodes," she said, voice like cracked stone, "you are hereby found guilty of reckless endangerment and child neglect. Your claim of misunderstanding is not supported by evidence, nor does your behavior reflect concern for the child's well-being." Janine's lips parted, but no sound came. "I am stripping you of all custodial rights to Lily Rhodes. Until further notice, Walter Bell will serve as her temporary guardian, under review by Child Protective Services. Sentencing for your charges is deferred, pending federal review. You are to remain within county jurisdiction." The gavel struck. Janine's face didn't change, but her hands, Walter noticed, shook in her lap. Lily looked up at him. "Did we win?" Walter bent down, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're safe now," he said. "That's what matters." The child nodded solemnly and leaned her cheek into Scout's warm fur. Outside the courthouse, snow began falling again, gentle, slow, like a blanket being drawn across the sky. Walter walked out holding Lily's hand. Reporters were waiting, but he waved them off. This wasn't a spectacle. This was survival. The snow had returned with a quiet vengeance, brushing the hospital windows with a fine mist of white, as if the sky itself were holding its breath. Inside Lily's room, the air was warmer, touched with the smell of antiseptic and old apple pie, Walter's latest offering from his oven. Scout dozed beneath the window, twitching now and then, ears rising whenever someone walked the hallway. Lily sat in bed, propped up with a pillow, sketching with crayons. She had drawn a tree with one long swing, a dog standing beneath it, and a small figure in a pink dress flying through the air. Her eyes, once clouded with fear, were brighter now. But there was still something missing, the kind of silence that didn't come from shyness, but from waiting. Walter sat beside her, flipping through a book of fairy tales, though he'd read them all to her twice over. When the knock came, gentle and measured, both of them looked up. Scout shot to his feet. "Come in," Walter called. The door opened, and in stepped a man who looked like he had walked through 3 winters to get here. Daniel Rhodes stood tall, about 6'2", with sun-browned skin that hadn't faded despite the cold, a square jaw shadowed with 3 days' worth of stubble, and close-cropped dark hair peppered with the beginnings of gray. His eyes were a deep hazel, storm-racked and rimmed with exhaustion. He wore his uniform still, the coat damp with melted snow, boots scuffed from the field. He looked like a soldier who had been summoned from war by a ghost. "Is she—" he started, but the words caught. Walter rose, his voice low. "She's safe. She's been waiting." Daniel stepped closer, and his knees buckled as he saw the little girl on the bed. Lily looked up at him, eyes wide, not yet understanding. Then she whispered, "Daddy?" The man's face crumpled. He dropped to one knee, his duffel slipping from his shoulder. "Pumpkin?" "Oh God, I'm so sorry." She threw herself at him. For a long while no one spoke. Lily sobbed into his shoulder, her tiny fingers gripping the back of his uniform like she'd never let go again. Daniel held her as if the world might shatter if he loosened his arms. Walter turned away, letting them have that moment, brushing at something in his eye. Scout sat beside him, tail wagging slowly, his gaze fixed on the reunion like he understood the weight of it. Later, they all sat in the quiet room. Lily was nestled in her father's lap, her head under his chin. "She wrote you a letter," Walter said, voice gruff. Daniel looked up. "A few words. She never sent it. But I read it. I hope that's okay." Daniel nodded, his throat tight. Walter handed him the wrinkled paper. The Marine's hands trembled as he opened it. "Dear Daddy, please come home. I'm scared." He closed his eyes. "I was deployed to southern Jordan," he said quietly. "Communications were limited. I got updates, mostly from Janine. She told me Lily was doing well, drawing, growing. I trusted her." Walter didn't speak. Some truths didn't need hammering. Daniel looked at him again, more steady now. "I know who you are. They told me at the hospital and the sheriff's office. You took care of my daughter. You and the dog." Walter shrugged. "She did most of the work. Brave little thing. I owe you everything. You owe her your presence." Daniel nodded again. A soft knock interrupted them. Nurse Elena stepped in, her usual calm wrapped in warm brown eyes and a clipboard. "Sorry, just a quick check on Lily's vitals. And Mr. Rhodes, welcome home." He gave a tired smile. Walter rose to let her work. While Elena moved around the room, Walter stepped out into the hallway. Daniel followed a few minutes later, rubbing his face with both hands. "She still startles when doors slam," he said. "She wouldn't when her mom was alive." Walter leaned against the wall. "Your wife?" Daniel exhaled. "Cancer. 2 years ago. Fast and cruel. Janine came along 6 months after. Thought maybe it'd be good for Lily to have someone steady." He shook his head. "Guess I was wrong." "She doesn't need perfect," Walter said. "Just someone who sees her." Daniel looked down at the scuffed tile floor. "I can't fix what's happened, but I'm here now." Walter nodded. "Then start there." That evening, the snow thickened. Daniel stayed with Lily until she fell asleep. Walter made sure he had a place to sleep in the guest wing of the hospital's veteran lodging, small but warm. Scout curled up outside Lily's door like he always did. In the dark, Daniel sat beside his daughter's bed, the crayon drawing tucked in his pocket. "Tomorrow," he whispered, stroking her hair, "we figure it all out, together." Winter in Elkhorn did not loosen its grip easily. Even as March crept onto the calendar, the air remained sharp and the ground stubbornly frozen. But in the quiet corners of the small town, signs of thaw were beginning to show, meltwater dripping from the eaves, icicles cracking loose and falling like glass to the earth below. And in one room on the 3rd floor of Elkhorn Medical, a little girl in a pale blue sweater sat at her window and waited. Lily's room was no longer the place of shadows it had once been. The walls were now lined with crayon drawings, mostly of dogs and barns, and a big tree with a swing that only she seemed to remember. Nurse Elena had brought in a small potted plant, and a paper chain of stars hung across her headboard. But the best part of the room was the window, because every afternoon, just before the sun slipped behind the hills, Scout would be there. He never barked, never whined, just sat, tail still, ears perked, looking up with those amber eyes, as if he were saying, "Still here, kid, still watching." Walter called it the watch post. Even though Scout was growing old, his legs stiffer in the cold, his loyalty had not dulled in the slightest. If anything, it had grown fiercer. Inside the room, Daniel sat across from Lily in the reading chair, his sleeves rolled up and his forearms resting on his knees. He looked better now. The haunted hollows under his eyes had faded some, and there was color in his cheeks again. Each day he shaved, helped fold laundry in the children's ward, and read Lily every bedtime story Walter had once done. "I talked to Walter this morning," Daniel said softly, watching Lily carefully arrange her crayons. She looked up, curious. "He found a small house, a fixer-upper near his land. Needs a new roof, maybe a door that doesn't creak like a ghost, but it's close to him, and close to Scout." Lily tilted her head. "Will there be chickens?" Daniel smiled. "There can be. And a tree for swinging? If not, we'll plant one." Lily thought about this. Can Scout come inside? Scout can sleep wherever he wants. Her smile lit the room. That evening, as dusk painted the sky lavender, Daniel went down to Walter's old pickup truck, parked in front of the hospital. He climbed in beside the man who had unknowingly become his closest friend. Walter was dressed as usual, flannel, denim, and that patched-up barn jacket that seemed immune to snow or time. His hands, thick-knuckled and veined, rested on the wheel. "She say yes?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "If there's chickens." Walter chuckled. "Guess I'll be building a coop." A comfortable silence settled between them. Then Walter said, more serious, "You sure about this move, son? Ain't much out here but trees, weather, and neighbors that talk more about tractors than taxes." Daniel looked up at the hospital window, where a tiny face watched them, framed in frost and hope. "It's everything I need." Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel threw himself into the renovations. The house was just a few miles from Walter's farm, small, weather-beaten, with a crooked porch and a wood stove that coughed more than it heated. But with Walter's help, and Scout supervising every step, they turned it into something almost cozy. Walter taught Daniel how to patch siding and mend a leaking pipe. Daniel, in turn, fixed the truck's clutch and repainted the old kitchen cabinets a soft sage green. In the evenings, they shared stew and stories while Scout snoozed near the fire. At the hospital, Lily's recovery continued. She walked steadier now, her appetite growing. The therapists praised her resilience, and the nurses doted on her as if she were their own. But every time Scout came to the window, her heart thudded like a drum. One Friday morning, just after the first spring birds had returned, Elena came into Lily's room with a bright smile and a small folder. "Well, little lady," she said, "I have good news." Lily looked up from her drawing. "You're officially ready to go home." Lily froze. "With Daddy?" Elena nodded. "And Walter will be there too. And yes," she added with a knowing grin, "Scout already knows. He's been wagging all morning." When the elevator doors opened to the hospital lobby, a small group had gathered. Walter stood in his best Sunday shirt, face freshly shaved. Daniel held a bouquet of wildflowers. And Scout. Scout was prancing in circles, tail spinning like a windmill. Lily stepped out in a new dress, pink again, but this one was soft, clean, and made just for her. Her hair was combed into pigtails. In her arms was the old stuffed bear from the barn, newly sewn and wearing a little red bow. Walter knelt first. "Ready to go home, kiddo?" Lily nodded. "Will there be pancakes?" "Only the best." Scout barked once, then bolted to the truck, tail high. They drove home through a corridor of trees, the light dappling through branches now budding with green. Lily leaned out the window, whined in her face, giggling like a songbird. When they reached the house, Daniel lifted her out. She ran up the porch steps, Scout right beside her, and stood at the threshold. Walter stepped forward. "This is yours now too, Lily. You've got roots here." She looked up at them. one old, one younger, both worn and stitched back together by love, and then turned toward the door. "Let's go inside." Together the three of them, child, father, and friend, stepped through with Scout curled just behind, ever faithful, ever watching. Sometimes the smallest souls carry the heaviest burdens, but even in a broken world, miracles still walk among us, sometimes on 2 feet, sometimes on 4. Lily was just a child, lost and forgotten by the world, but God never forgot her. He sent an old man with a tender heart, a retired K-9 with eyes that still saw pain, and a father broken by war but mended by love. That's the kind of miracle you won't read in headlines, but you'll feel it if you believe. If this story touched your heart, say amen in the comments below, and may every child find their way home, just like Lily did. Share this story with someone who still believes in second chances. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to our channel, click the bell icon, and be part of a community where kindness, faith, and loyalty still matter. God bless you, and may Scout's quiet watch remind us all. Sometimes angels don't wear wings. Sometimes they wear fur.